Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. In turn, I'll usually suggest armor and trinkets that allow for high damage, and the necessary defense or support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. That usually also means that the build is not necessarily always the best in slot choice, but it will pass a certain DPS threshold under the usual raid buffs and get you through pretty much all open world content on your own if needed. Today's class is the Mesmer and the elite specialization of choice is the Virtuoso, and we're going to talk through two different build variants, an open world roaming build and a conditioned DPS build. For starters, let's talk through some basic pros and cons of the build. One of the nicest things about Virtuoso is that it doesn't have the usual Mesmer clone micromanagement. On top, it has good sustain passively from Jagged Mind and the Aether Signet, and great damage with a 38k benchmark on the Golem with a very simple rotation that is also fully ranged. Since the build relies on offensive gameplay and stats to function, it is squishy and not that great at handling pressure. Also, since most skills in the build are projectiles, you need to be aware of reflex, otherwise you might nuke yourself. Finally, the build has low support capabilities, it doesn't share any boons and also has low native CC built into its kit. Now before we go into the details of that skill kit, let's look at the general playstyle of Virtuoso. It's basically the light version of a Mesmer, in that it does not require you to micromanage clones as I said before. Instead, you will stock up blades that you can fire at your enemies using the blade songs, the 4 abilities above your weapon skill bar. These blades stay and get stocked out of combat as well and do not get removed when changing targets, like clones do on Mirage and Chronomancer. This is great, particularly for open world roaming since you don't have to resummon clones all the time. The whole elite specialization centers around fast blade generation and timing your blade songs right. You can still create phantasms, but after they are done with the animation they'll be turned into blades. You also gain access to blade skills and psionic type skills. All 3 dagger skills, all blade songs and all Virtuoso utilities but one count as blades. They also give a hint in the tooltip indicating so. Blade songs further count as shatter skills for everything that applies to or synergizes with shatters, so keep that in mind for when we talk about traits and specializations later on. In general, it feels great to play, both mechanically and visually. You are fully ranged, blasting mobs with your blades fluidly. While it is a great quality of life improvement for Mesmers, not having clones has a downside though. They are not there as decoys, so you always get the full aggro when you're alone. This can be challenging in solo gameplay when you encounter enemies that cannot be kited easily. For those you might want to pack in additional defense, but more on that later. Alright, let's dive into the build, starting with the weapon choices and the skill loadout. We'll be using dagger as the main hand weapon, always. Never swap off of dagger. Anything else is a DPS loss because dagger skills are the only weapon skills that count as blades. With the right trait choices, blade skills are your main source for stocking additional blades and applying tons of stacks of bleeding to enemies through Jagged Mind. You can get over 80 stacks of bleeding on a single enemy this way. And with more bleeding stacks, you stock more blades through Bloodsong. Jagged Mind is essential for the condition playstyle on Virtuoso since it is responsible for the vast amounts of bleeding that you apply and also the reason why we want to reach the crit cap at pretty much all costs. The faster you stock up blades, the faster you can use your blade songs and the more you heal. For the offhand, we'll be using a torch for group content and a pistol for general open world and scenarios where you might be forced into staying at range. You can also add a sword to this, but more on that later. In group content, the offhand is only there for memes or utility mostly though, since using dagger skills and the bleeding that comes with them is basically more powerful than any alternative anyway. Let's start with the blade songs, because they are the main priority of the rotation later on. For damage purposes, we'll be using 2 of them with a high priority and 1 with a lower priority as a filler for times when the other 2 aren't available. In open world, all of them have a purpose. The first blade song is Harmony. This is the standard blade song with the lowest cooldown. With our trait choices, this becomes an ammo skill, so we can use it more often. More pew pew means more bleeding, more damage. This is priority number 2 after the second blade song, Sorrow. Similar to the shatter skills on Chrono and Mirage, this skill applies a ton of conditions, torment, confusion and the usual bleeding, and is the most loaded skill in your kit. That's why we're going to use this off cooldown. but make sure that you always use it with 5 blades because the effects listed in the tooltip applied per stocked blade. This also grants you Fury upon use, which is an essential boon for both the crit chance and expertise it provides in the build, so there's that. Up next we have Dissonance. This is a nice CC skill, but it's not the greatest tool for damage. That's why we only use this as a filler when both Harmony and Sorrow are off cooldown for longer than a few seconds in group content or whenever CC is required. In open world you can obviously use this to apply decent amounts of CC as well. Finally, the last Blade song is Blade Turn Requiem. This is a defensive skill, but nonetheless pretty useful. It will cause you to block all incoming attacks for a brief time and damage enemies around you with blades while doing that. This is an emergency button that makes you invincible to incoming attacks, so make use of it when needed. Also, when you use Bountiful Disillusionment, this will give you regeneration, which is an essential buff for the Chaos variant of the build. Alright, moving on to dagger skills. The dagger auto attack Flying Cutter is pretty basic. It sends a blade to the target and deals damage. When you hit enemies with 3 casts of Flying Cutter within 5 seconds, 3 additional blades are launched. As I said before, almost all skills that we're using in the build have a range of 1200, which is one of the greatest benefits of Virtuoso. When using pistol, you even have a full 1200 range without losing a significant amount of damage. This is very convenient when learning mechanics in group content, since you can freely position yourself, and also in open world since you can avoid damage way easier by simply kiting around. Skill number 2 is Blade Call, and one of the few reasons why staying at full range costs you some damage. This skill throws out a fan of daggers in a conal shape, so standing at high range means that often not all of them will hit, which means fewer bleeding stacks. You still stock up an additional blade when at least one of these daggers hits, so it's not that much of a problem. Skill number 3 is Unstable Blade Storm. It's a slow moving AoE that regularly damages enemies and sends blades at them. This skill and Blade Call are better against larger hitboxes since they will hit more reliably. As the offhand weapons, you can go for pretty much anything you want. In group content I typically use Torch because the Prestige is a skill without a cast time and can thus be used without any real trade-off every once in a while. The best overall weapon combination I found were Pistol and Torch for group content, since they both have decent CC capabilities, and then Sword and Pistol for open world because Sword gives you access to a very short cooldown block that can be used against harder bosses, and it synergizes well with using Dueling since it allows you to make use of Fence's Finesse for some nice added ferocity. I'm not going to go through all the offhand weapon skills now, but most of them are pretty useful in certain scenarios. Moving on to utilities. For the healing skill you have 2 different options. Number 1 is the Signet of the Aether, which heals you for a good amount on every blade you stock. This is a really powerful passive healing tool, I almost never take this off. The second option is Twin Blade Restoration. This would be nice if the boons on it were all guaranteed for some additional regeneration when using Chaos, but they're not, so the usefulness of this skill is limited compared to the Signet. This does have a Condi cleanse on it though, so it's quite useful if you need that. After that we have a Flag Spot. In open world I like Sword of Decimation for additional CC through Immobilize when dealing with boss enemies, and Rain of Swords otherwise. Rain of Swords is a very powerful AoE damage tool, so always use it in group content. The 2 signets after that are Signet of Domination and Signet of Midnight, and these are also set in stone. They provide both condition damage and expertise. While it isn't recommended to use them actively, you can use the Signet of Domination for additional CC at a temporary cost of 180 condition damage. In case you need to drop one of them, it should be the Signet of Midnight, since expertise is easier to come by via food, traits or gear choices than extra condition damage. The elite skill should always be 1000 Cuts. It has a relatively short cooldown, strong damage, and also applies additional condis via the Crate rune, but more on that in a second when we talk about gear choices. Just try to position yourself so that you hit enemies reliably with this, since the line it shoots is pretty narrow. Talking about the Crate rune brings me to gear attributes. The gear on Condi Virtuoso is a bit special. You can use the traditional Viper gear with Elementalist Nightmare runes and stuff, but it's not ideal. Ideal is a combination of Sinister and Rampager gear if you don't have Precision and Condi Damage infusions, or full Sinister if you do. Optimize your build for maximum Precision and Condi Damage, with Precision actually taking the highest priority. If you need additional defense, you can swap a few Sinister pieces for Rabbit to trade power for Toughness 1-to-1. You shouldn't really need much defense though, since you can avoid most incoming damage through blocks, dodges and kiting. In general, you should be aiming for around 60% crit in your hero panel without Spotter or the Warrior banners. The reason why we're not running Viper as much is that most of the damage in this build comes from bleeding, so going for stuff that increases bleeding duration in particular is ideal. The required expertise for 100% bleeding duration comes from running Chaos, which has 240 equaling 18%, having Fury, which grants 150 equaling 10%, Crate Runes that have 50%, the Signet of Midnight, and the new Kimchi Pancakes food with 15% bleeding duration. I also tested Grieving gear, but you lose out on some precision, and precision is really powerful in Virtuoso because of the increased chance of applying bleeding, so I don't recommend using Grieving on this. Having high precision is also particularly relevant because the devs have announced that they might change banners to be boon focused, so we might lose the 5% crit from the banner. If that indeed happens, you can compensate it through 1 or 2 more Rampager gear pieces, for example. The sigils I run are Earth and Accuracy. You could run another dagger with a Geomancy sigil on it and just weapon swap off cooldown for another DPS gain, but it's rather minor. There's no need to change any of this for open world. Even there, going for as much crit chance as possible is ideal, especially given that it makes the playstyle much more fluid through quicker blade stocks. A really good alternative gear choice for open world is Celestial with Traveler Runes. If you want to gain a lot of survivability at the cost of a chunk of damage and pace of blade stocks, go for that. Alright, now that we got gear covered, we can talk about specializations, traits and consumables. As usual, I won't explain every trait in detail, but rather focus on the traits that define the playstyle. I've touched upon many of them already, but we'll go into more detail now. The trait line that we'll always use is Illusions. Illusions is particularly powerful on Virtuoso because 2 effects in this trait line trigger per blade: Maim the Disillusioned and Compounding Power. So you will have max stacks of Compounding Power up permanently in combat and apply a lot of torment on blade songs, 5 per cast with full blades. On top of that, the trait line improves blade songs by reducing the cooldown and making harmony and ammo skill, as I've mentioned before. In the Celestial variant, always go with Master of Fragmentation to be able to reach the crit cap on blade song harmony. The second core trait line is basically a matter of preference. I prefer dueling for general open world because it gives you more bleeding on blade skills since sharper images triggers on them, and also increases your uptime on Vigor and Fury. These will suck otherwise. When using pistol in open world, it also makes pistol skills apply bleeding as well, and grants a recharge on them upon interrupting a foe, which is a nice little DPS gain. For the Master and Grandmaster traits in dueling, I went with Fence's Finesse and Superiority Complex. Most Conti Mesmers run the synergy between Blinding Dissipation, which also triggers per blade by the way, and Inaptitude for additional confusion stacks. You can run that, but with the high amount of precision in the build, the 2 ferocity focused stats actually become very effective. If you don't intend to use a sword, you can also just slot Binding Dissipation for some additional CC. In group content, pretty much always run Chaos. Regeneration uptime should be good in most groups, making this incredibly powerful both offensively and defensively. In cases where it's not, you can also use dueling instead. When you have regeneration, Chaos will make you have an additional 120 Condi Damage, another 10% increased condition damage, and reduced Condi Damage taken. It also grants 240 concentration, well, not that you would grant a lot of boons, and expertise, and further improve your blade songs through Bountiful Disillusionment. Note that through this trait, you can provide yourself with regeneration by using Blade Turn Requiem. Especially Illusionary defense is really strong on Virtuoso because it stacks up for every blade you stock, leading to a quasi-permanent 25% decrease to incoming strike damage. Even though the dueling variant allows for more complex rotations dealing around 40k DPS, I think the massive boost to survivability from running Chaos is definitely worth the trade-off. If you know you'll need defense in open world, this is also the go-to specialization. This also becomes more powerful in the Celestial variant where you reach around 80% boon duration and have a much easier time maintaining regeneration and fury. Finally, we have Virtuoso as the lead specialization, of course. The traits from the bottom line here are set in stone since they are all universally useful on condition builds. With the traits of choice, we'll apply bleeding on every critical hit with blade attacks, heal for 3% of the outgoing Condi damage, have all damage increased upon using a blade song for a short duration, have Fury grant 150 expertise and 10% additional crit chance, and finally stock a blade for every 5 stacks of bleeding we apply. Especially Jagged Mind and Blood Song synergize perfectly. You apply bleeding stacks so fast that you'll permanently stock blades at a really fast rate, so that you can use your blade songs off cooldown. And even better, blade songs are blade skills themselves, so they'll also apply bleeding and stock even more blades. One could call this a bladeception. Or not. For consumable items, the best food is the plate of kimchi pancakes. It grants 15% bleeding duration and 70 condition damage, which is perfect since the majority of damage, as I said before, comes from bleeding. You can get the recipe in New Kaineng from a vendor after a particular event. Utility item is the usual toxic focusing crystal for higher Condi damage, or if you can afford it, the writ of masterful malice to squeeze out a little added DPS in group content. Now that we've got the build covered, let's talk about the rotation. It's really easy and pretty forgiving, since you don't really need to keep track of auto attacks due to the 5-second tracking window on the flurry effect of Flying Cutter. You're also fully ranged, so you don't need to worry about your attacks not hitting stuff. The only downside is that when running Chaos, you are reliant on external sources of regeneration and fury to reach the maximum potential. Generally, you want to make sure that you use a Blade Song at least every 5 seconds. The reason for that is Deadly Blades, which increases all damage by 5% for 5 seconds when using one. This and the passive benefits of stocking blades again after it is also why we're using Blade Song Dissonance as a filler when the other two are off cooldown for longer than a few seconds. As the opener, you want to start with Blade Song Sorrow and then use 1000 Cuts and Rain of Swords. You should then have 5 blades available quickly so that you can cast the first Blade Song Harmony and then a few seconds after that cast it again. Then use Blade Song Dissonance as a filler until the next Harmony comes up. The priority, as I said before, is Blade Song Sorrow. It's also a good opener for open worlds because it grants Fury, so you have the crit chance and expertise buffs covered for a bit. Then priority number 2 is Blade Song Harmony. You should be reaching full blades within a maximum of 2 to 3 seconds after casting the last Blade Song, so you can use Harmony whenever it comes off cooldown 2 to 3 seconds before Sorrow does. Aside from that, use all skills aside from the Signet and Blade Turn Requiem off cooldown, with the restriction that if a Blade Song is about to come off cooldown, like within 2 seconds, and you have another skill available, wait and cast the Blade Song first. The reason is that this way you get blades up quicker than just auto-attacking to be able to use the next Blade Song as soon as possible. That is it for today. I hope that this guide video was insightful for you and made you want to try Condition Virtuoso. I certainly am enjoying it. It's the build I use for the End of Dragon story, strikes and raids right now, and it's been a blast. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. See you next time and happy slashing.